The whole town laughed when I spent my last dollar on a condemned mine. Then my dog found the wall.
They called him the Fool of Briar Hollow, bought 14 acres of useless land for the price of a used pickup, an old mine shaft condemned since the war, a tin roof cabin nobody wanted. The town laughed at the drifter and his German shepherd. They did not know who he was. Jax Harlan, 12 years in uniform, came home to a wife who had sold his life out from under him. Smokey was the only soldier left who still answered his call. Then a storm came down off the ridge, and a dog's nose found something hidden since 1864. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from today. The cold came down out of the Tennessee ridges before the sun did, sliding through the seams of the rusted Ford pickup with the patient indifference of something that had been doing this work for 100 winters and intended to do it for 100 more. Jax Harlan opened his eyes inside that cold without moving, the way he had been taught to wake a long time ago, in another country, on another piece of dirt that had nothing to do with this one. He listened first. Cicadas. The wind moving the dry hickory leaves against the sheet metal of the truck cab. A single mourning dove somewhere up the ridge calling and going quiet, calling and going quiet. The sound of a world that did not know he was in it. He lay flat on his back across the bench seat with his canvas backpack jammed under his head as a pillow, and his combat boots still laced, because a man who did not lace his boots in the dark was a man who had never needed to, and Jax Harlan had needed to more times than he could remember. His breath came out in slow white plumes that fogged the inside of the windshield and softened the edges of the grey dawn beyond it. Somewhere outside the cab, low and steady, came the soft shift of a heavy body settling against the back tire. Smokey, always within 6 feet, always within hearing, always within reach. He sat up. The vinyl of the bench seat had frozen overnight in the shape of his back, and the cold of it pulled through his old surplus jacket and through the thermal beneath it and into the long muscles along his spine, finding the scar tissue there the way cold always did, the way it had since the second deployment, the way it would until the day they put him in the ground. He did not let himself acknowledge the ache. He breathed once through his nose, slow, and rolled his shoulders the small, precise way he had been taught by an army physical therapist a lifetime ago, and the muscles clicked and shifted and held. Outside the truck, the sky over Briar Hollow was the colour of wet pewter. The 14 acres he had bought sat in a notch between the steep wooded ridge and the bend of a tributary that fed down into the Clinch River 2 miles south. The land sloped in 3 directions, none of them gentle. A tin roof cabin from the 1930s sat halfway up the slope, its porch sagging on the riverside, its wood stove pipe rusted through near the cap, its single window milky with 80 years of weather. Beyond the cabin, set into the base of the ridge like a wound that had never closed, was the mouth of the old Pritchard coal mine, condemned by the state in 1947 and slowly forgotten by everyone who had ever drawn a wage from it. A few feet of timber bracing still stood at the entrance. The rest of the world had decided it was not worth the cost of remembering. He had paid $9,400 cash for all of it. Every dollar he had left in the world after Marisol had finished with the rest. He stepped down out of the cab, and his boots came down on frosted dirt that crunched once and held. Smokey rose from the wheel well in one fluid movement, her thick double coat carrying the night's cold in its outer guard hairs, her amber eyes already mapping the morning, already counting the directions of sound, already cataloguing anything that did not belong. She did not greet him. They had stopped greeting each other a long time ago. There was no need. He laid one scarred hand on the broad, warm flat of her skull and held it there for the count of 3, and her heavy-plumed tail thumped twice against the rear bumper, and that was the morning. The hardware store down in town opened at 6:30. Jax pulled the watch his grandfather had left him out of his jacket pocket, checked the cracked face and slid it back. He had time. He started a small fire in the rust-pitted ring of stones he had built 3 weeks ago between the truck and the cabin, fed it with hickory shavings he had cut the night before, and set the dented camp percolator on the iron grate. Smokey lay down 10 feet from the fire with her front paws crossed and her chin between them, watching the tree line up the ridge, watching the way she had been trained to watch in another country, watching because nothing in her had retired when the army had retired her. He had bought the land for the mine. That was the truth he did not say out loud, because in this town, in this part of the world, in this America that had stopped knowing what to do with him, saying it would only confirm what they already thought, they thought he was a drifter who had been swindled by Old Man Coe at the realty office. They thought he was a damaged man who had bought damaged land because damaged was all he could afford. They were correct about the price. They were wrong about the reason. A mine, even a played-out one, even a condemned one, even one the state had walked away from 80 years ago, was cool in summer and warm in winter and dark and dry and could be defended by one man and one dog from any direction that mattered. A mine had one entrance. A mine had stone walls. A mine could store food that would not spoil and water that would not freeze and supplies that would not be stolen. A mine, with a few weeks of careful work at the front chamber, could become something a man could survive in for as long as the world refused to let him belong to it. He had walked the property 4 times before he signed the papers. The first walk was for the cabin, the second was for the water table, the third was for the sight lines from the ridge, the fourth was for the mine. He had stood at the mouth of the Pritchard for almost an hour that 4th time. The cold air sliding up out of the dark like a slow exhale, the smell of old iron and old water and old timbers folding around him, and he had understood the way an old soldier understands a piece of ground. This was high enough that the river would never reach it. This was hidden enough that the road would never find it. This was solid enough that a storm could come down off the ridge and not move it. He had nodded once to no one and walked back to the realty office and signed everything old Coe had put in front of him. The town had laughed before he made it back to his truck. The coffee in the percolator began to ping against the lid. He poured it black into the same dented enamel cup he had carried through 3 deployments, and held it between both hands and did not drink yet. Smoky lifted her head once, scanned, set it back down. The mourning dove on the ridge called and went quiet, down through the bare hardwoods where the slope fell off toward the county road. He could just hear the long, slow whine of a logging truck working a low gear up the grade. He closed his eyes for a moment, and the smell of the coffee hit some part of him he could not seal off, and he was in a wooden chair in a kitchen in a small house in southern Virginia, and Marisol was standing at the counter in a green sweater, and the morning sun was coming through the curtains the way it had only come through that one set of curtains in that one kitchen in that one life, and his older boy was at the table drawing something in crayon, and the younger one was asleep on his shoulder, and the coffee in his hand was the coffee Marisol made, and everything was still whole. He opened his eyes. The kitchen was gone. The curtains were gone. Marisol was in Charlotte now with a man named Derek, whose name Jax had only learned because the divorce papers had required it. The boys were 10 and 7, and they did not know him any more. The house had been sold while he was still at Walter Reed, 2 months into the recovery from the back surgery. With a power of attorney he had signed in good faith because he had still believed her. The savings she had moved before that. The truck title she had taken in the 2nd week of his admission, claiming she needed it to drive him to physical therapy, and then never bringing it back. Every legal protection a married man takes for granted she had used in the order they were designed to be used in, and by the time he had the strength to stand in a courtroom, there was nothing left for any judge to give back to him. His mother had told him, on the one phone call he had managed to make from the hospital payphone, that he should have known better. His brother had not picked up. His sister had texted once weeks later to say she could not get involved. The family that had raised him, the family that had pinned the flag on his chest at his enlistment ceremony, had folded up neatly into their own lives and closed the door behind them. He drank the coffee. It was hot enough to hurt. He held it in his mouth until it stopped hurting, and then swallowed. Smokey's ear flicked down the slope, far below. A single engine started somewhere on the county road, ran for a moment, settled into the long descending whine of a vehicle going downhill in 2nd gear. Smokey's ear came back to neutral. The engine faded. The cicadas, the ones that had hatched late this year and were still calling in the cold mornings, started up again from the hickory at the edge of the cleared yard. A long, dry grinding sound layered over itself, building and falling in waves the way they always did. The cicadas had been the first thing. He did not let himself think about that any more than he had to. The cicadas in the eastern Afghan summer had sounded almost the same. Almost. He had learned to live around the sound. He had learned to recognize when the sound was just sound and when his body was about to mistake it for something else, he had learned the small private list of physical actions that brought him back. Pressing his thumbnail into the pad of his index finger until it left a half moon, counting 4 exhales out, locating 5 things in the visual field by colour, finding Smokey with one hand. The list was long now, the list got longer every year. He finished the coffee, he rinsed the cup with a splash from the water jug. He walked over to where Smokey lay watching the tree line and crouched beside her and ran his fingers down the long ridge of her spine, over the place near her left shoulder where the surgery scar was still faintly visible under the thick coat, the place a piece of shrapnel had gone in 7 years ago in a village, neither of them ever named again. She tilted her head up and her amber eyes held his in the grey light, and there was nothing in her gaze that was not steady, and nothing in her gaze that was not his. She had been 7 when they brought them both home. She was 14 now. The vet in Roanoke last spring had said 5 years if they were lucky, 3 if they were not, and Jax had thanked the man and walked out and not let himself feel anything until he was back in the truck. And even then he had only let himself feel it for the count of 1 slow exhale before he sealed it back down where it belonged. He stood. He stretched the long muscles of his back the small, precise way the physical therapist had taught him. He looked once at the cabin he was slowly making habitable, with its missing porch boards and its broken window and its wood stove that needed a new pipe, and once at the mine he was slowly clearing out 50 feet at a time, and once at the grey sky over the ridge that smelled of weather coming. Then he pulled the truck door open, and Smokey jumped up onto the bench seat in one clean motion, and they drove down the rutted drive toward the county road, toward the hardware store, toward another day of the slow patient work of being a man who refused to disappear. The frost was still on the bottoms of the fence posts when he came back up the drive that morning 8 days later, and he saw the truck before he saw her. It was an old Ford F-150, the long bed kind they had stopped making the way they used to make them, painted a faded shade of red that had begun life closer to barn red and had weathered down to the colour of dried clay. It sat at the base of his drive where the gravel met the county road, hood up, hazards blinking, a thin curl of steam rising from the radiator into the cold November air. Smokey's ears came forward in the passenger seat, her whole body went still. She was already reading the situation before Jax had finished braking. He pulled in behind the Ford, killed his engine, set the parking brake the way he set every parking brake, and stepped down. Smokey came out behind him without being told, and stayed at his left heel, and oriented her head toward the figure that was visible now through the rear cab window of the red truck, a small hunched outline in a long brown coat. The driver's door opened slowly, and an older woman climbed down. She was not tall, she had not been tall in a long time. She had silver hair pulled back into a loose knot at the base of her skull, and she wore a brown wool coat that had been a good coat once and was still keeping its shape, and she carried herself with the careful upright dignity of a woman who had spent her whole life refusing to be small. She turned when she heard his door, and she did not flinch when she saw the German shepherd at his side, and she did not flinch when she saw the bearded man in the surplice jacket either, which was the first thing Jax noticed about her. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice was clear and unhurried, with the soft, long vowels of a woman who had grown up in these hollows and never lived anywhere else. "I think I've broken down on your drive." "It's not my drive yet," Jax said. "It's the county's for another 50 feet. She allowed herself a small, dry smile at that. The smile lifted only one side of her mouth, and it was gone almost before it had arrived, and Jax found himself filing it away the way he filed away small, honest things. "Either way," she said. "I'm in your road." "How long have you been here?" "About 40 minutes. He looked at the steam rising from the radiator, and the way her hands were tucked deep into her coat pockets, and the slight tightness around her eyes that meant cold she was not letting herself acknowledge. And he glanced at the dashboard through the open driver's window, and saw the temperature gauge pegged hard against the red. "You let it cool all the way down?" "As best I could." He nodded once. "I'll take a look." She moved a step back from the open hood without being asked, the way a person moved who had grown up around men working on engines and knew the small unspoken etiquette of it. Jax set his hand on the radiator cap with his glove on. felt the heat through the leather, and waited another full minute before he twisted it off in slow, careful stages, the way his father had shown him in a gravel driveway in Roanoke County in 1992. Smokey had moved to a position near the front bumper of the Ford where she could see both the woman and the tree line, and the bend of the county road, and her amber eyes were steady on the woman's coat pockets, and her ears were soft and forward, and her tail was carried low and neutral. She had decided already. Jack saw it without needing to look. He filed that away too. The radiator was bone dry. A hairline crack along the upper seam had been weeping for a long time, and somewhere on the climb up the grade it had finally given up. He told her that, plainly, the way you tell a person something that is not their fault but is going to cost them money they do not have. She received it the way some people receive bad news, with no protest and no theatrics and a small, slow nod. "I figured it was something like that," she said. "Frank used to keep the radiators on these old Fords going with stop leak and prayer. I never learnt the prayer." "Frank," Jax said. "My husband. He's been gone 8 years." She said it without weight, the way a person says a thing she has learned to carry. Jax did not respond. He had learned that some sentences did not want responses. He had a 5-gallon jug of water in the bed of his own truck and a tube of radiator stop leak in the toolbox behind the cab, and he used both, and within 20 minutes he had her engine running long enough to limp the truck up his drive and park it on the level patch beside his cabin where she could leave it overnight if she had to. She had agreed without argument, she had thanked him without performance. She had introduced herself as Eleanor Beaumont, and she had asked his name, and he had given her only the first one, and she had nodded as if first names were enough. While the engine cooled the second time, she stood beside the open passenger door of her truck and looked out across the slope at his land, at the tin roof cabin, and the cleared circle of dirt around the fire pit, and the dark mouth of the old Pritchard mine in the base of the ridge beyond. Her face did not change. She looked at it the way a woman looks at land she has known her whole life. "You bought the co-parcel," she said. "I did. They told you about the mine." "They did. They told you it was condemned." "They did. They told you the cabin's not insurable." "That too. And you bought it anyway." "I bought it because of all that," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she gave him the small one-sided smile again, briefer this time. "And," she said, "then maybe you're not as foolish as Briar Hollow says you are." He did not answer that. She had not asked him to. Inside the cab of her truck, on the dashboard mounted in a small black frame screwed through the vinyl, was a Korean service medal on a faded ribbon. He had seen it the moment he opened the hood, and he had not let himself look at it twice, because looking twice would have been a question. Eleanor Beaumont followed his gaze now without him moving his eyes, the way old women sometimes followed gazes, and she said, "Frank's combat engineer? How did you know?" "The shape of the medal cluster, the way it's mounted." She looked at him a long moment then. Her eyes were the pale grey of the river in November, and there was nothing soft in them, and there was nothing hard in them either. And Jax understood in that moment that Eleanor Beaumont was a woman who had spent 8 years learning how to be alone, and had not made peace with it, and never would, and was upright anyway. "You served," she said. It was not a question. "I did." "How long?" 12 years. "Where?" 2 tours in Iraq. 2 in Afghanistan. Some places in between. "And now you're here." "Now I'm here." She nodded once, slowly, the way a woman nods when a thing that did not need explaining has finished not explaining itself. She turned back to her truck. From the seat she lifted a worn brown leather handbag, and from the handbag she took an envelope, and she stood for a moment with the envelope in her gloved hand, and then she folded it in half and put it back. He pretended not to see. She pretended he had not. Smokey had crossed the gravel without sound, and was standing now at Eleanor's left side, just behind her hip, the way a service dog stands without ever having been one. She lifted her broad black and tan head and laid it, with a deliberation that was not accidental, against the back of Eleanor Beaumont's gloved hand. Eleanor went very still. She did not pull her hand away, she did not speak, She simply turned her wrist, slowly, the way a woman who has known dogs her whole life turns a wrist, and she let her gloved fingers settle on the broad, warm flat between Smokey's ears, and she stood there for a long moment with her eyes on the ridge, and her hand on the dog and her breath coming out in small white plumes in the November cold. "Frank had a shepherd," she said, "after a while, when he came home from Korea. For 13 years. He told me once she was the only thing in the country that knew what he had seen." Jax did not answer. There was no answer. "My truck won't make it back up to my place tonight," she said. "No. I live up Calhoun Ridge Road, about 2 miles past the bridge. I'll drive you home. I can call my neighbor. I'll drive you home." She looked at him, and her grey eyes moved across his face the way a woman's eyes move when she is deciding something, and then she nodded. In the cab of his truck on the way up Calhoun Ridge Road, with Smokey between them on the bench seat, and the road climbing through bare hardwoods that smelled of wet leaves and approaching weather, Eleanor Beaumont told him, in the flat, unhurried voice of a woman reciting bad news to herself, that her property tax assessment had tripled in 2 years, that the bank held a small second mortgage Frank had taken in 2009 to pay for his last surgery, that the bank had filed for foreclosure in October, and that she had 3 weeks before the auction on the courthouse steps. Her son, she said, lived in Memphis and would not help. Her daughter had died of cancer in 2014. The farmhouse on Calhoun Ridge had been her grandmother's grandmother's, 6 generations. She would be the last. She told him also, almost as an aside, almost as if she did not believe the family story herself anymore, that her great-great-grandfather Samuel Calhoun had walked off into these woods during the war and never come back, and that her great-great-grandmother had raised her son alone in a one-room cabin 3 counties over, and that nobody in 4 generations had ever known what had happened to him. The story had survived, that was all the story, and the name and a tin-type photograph in a tin box under her bed. He listened. He did not interrupt. Smokey lay across his right thigh with her chin on Eleanor's left knee. When he pulled into the gravel turnaround at the side of her white clapboard farmhouse, with its sagging porch and its wood-shingled roof, and its single hand-painted sign at the foot of the drive that read Beaumont Vegetables sat 8 to 1, he sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel and did not look at her. "I can help," he said, "with the foreclosure paperwork, if you want." Why? He thought about it. He thought about the medal on her dashboard, and the shepherd Frank had loved, and Smokey's chin on her knee, and the fact that Smokey had decided 8 minutes after meeting her that this was a person who needed to be helped, and that Smokey in 14 years had never been wrong about a person. Not once. Not on either continent. "Because my dog says so," he said. Eleanor Beaumont sat in his passenger seat for a long, quiet moment with her hands folded in her lap. Then she opened the door, and she stepped down. And before she shut it, she looked back at him through the open frame and said, "Tomorrow morning. 8 o'clock. The county clerk's office." 8 o'clock, he said. She closed the door, and Smokey watched her walk up onto the porch, and Jax watched too, and neither of them spoke on the long drive back down the ridge. The county clerk's office in the basement of the Briar Hollow courthouse smelled of old paper and old radiator paint, and the faint chemical sweetness of a window cleaner that had been used for decades on glass, that had not gotten any cleaner. Fluorescent tubes ran the length of the low ceiling in a ragged double line, and one of them buzzed at a pitch just below the threshold of conscious hearing, a small, steady electric hum that pressed against the back of Jax's neck, the way that kind of sound always did. He felt it land. He felt it work its way down into the muscle along his spine. He breathed once through his nose, slow, and pressed his thumbnail into the pad of his index finger until he felt the half-moon, and he was still in the basement of the Briar Hollow courthouse, and Eleanor Beaumont was beside him in her good brown wool coat. And Smokey was outside in the cab of the truck because no dogs were allowed in the building, and the day was just starting. The clerk was a woman in her 50s with a steel-coloured perm and a name tag that read Delarares, and she looked up from her keyboard once when they came in, and her eyes went to Jax's beard and his surplus jacket and the canvas backpack at his feet, and they went to Eleanor's brown coat, and they went back to Jack's and they decided something. Eleanor did not see it. Jack's did. He had been seeing that look since he had come home. "We're here about the deed records for the Beaumont property on Calhoun Ridge Road," Eleanor said. Her voice was clear and unhurried, the way it had been at the bottom of his drive the morning before. "Parcel number 047-B19. I need certified copies of the original chain of title." Dolores typed. She did not type quickly. She typed with the careful one-finger precision of a woman who had refused to learn anything new in 20 years and had no intention of starting today. After a long moment, she said, without looking up, "Original deed's not in the system. Looks like it's filed downstairs. Could be a while." "How long is a while?" 2 weeks. Maybe 3. We're short-staffed." "I have 3 weeks." "Then it might not be 3 weeks. Or it might be 4. I'm telling you what I can." Jax stepped one step closer to the counter. Not aggressively, just enough that Dolores had to look up. He spoke quietly. "Ma'am, Mrs. Beaumont's farmhouse is in foreclosure. The auction is in 21 days. She needs the deed certified before the auction, or she loses her right to challenge it. Is there a way to expedite?" Dolores looked at him for a long moment. He did not break the look. He was not aggressive, and he was not soft, and he had not learned the technique in any school. He had learned it in a courtyard in Tikrit, standing in front of a man with a pistol who had not yet decided whether to use it. The technique was older than that. The technique was as old as men dealing with men who had power they did not earn. "There's a $50 expedite fee," Dolores said. "Finally. We'll pay it, cash or money order." Eleanor reached for her purse. Jax was faster. He laid 2 20s and a 10 on the counter without looking at her, and Eleanor's hand stopped halfway to her bag, and she did not say anything. And Jax did not look at her, and Dolores took the bills and made out a receipt without a word. It was the first of the 4 times that morning he paid something Eleanor could not. The lawyer's office was on the 2nd floor of a brick building across the square, above a dental practice and a storefront that had been a video rental in 1995 and was now empty. The lawyer was named Whitaker. He was perhaps 40, perhaps younger, with the soft pink hands of a man who had never used them for anything but keyboards and golf clubs, and he sat behind a wide oak desk and looked at the foreclosure notice Eleanor had brought him through reading glasses he did not need yet, and he made the small sucking sound through his teeth that lawyers made when they were about to charge a person money she did not have. $3,500 to take the case, he said. Half down today. The other half at the hearing. "I don't have $3,500, Eleanor said. "Mrs. Beaumont, I understand this is a difficult situation, but this is what it costs. The work involved, the filings, the court appearances, the research. I have a practice to run. Will you take $500 down and a payment plan?" Jack said. Whitaker looked at him for the first time. His eyes did the same calculation Dolores's had done in the basement. He came to the same conclusion. "I'm afraid not. We don't do payment plans on cases this complex, and I'd need to know the source of any retainer funds for compliance reasons." "It's my money," Jack said. "And you are. I'm a friend. A friend." "That's right." Whitaker sat back in his chair. He set the foreclosure notice down on his desk and squared its edges. He spoke to Eleanor without looking at Jax. "Mrs. Beaumont, I have to say this. If you don't have the retainer, you might want to consider whether the property is worth fighting for. Sometimes letting these things go is the kindest thing a family can do for itself. There's no shame in it." Eleanor Beaumont did not move. She was looking at Whitaker the way a cat looks at a thing it has decided is beneath responding to. After a long moment she said, in the same clear, unhurried voice she had used at the bottom of Jax's drive, "Mr. Whitaker, my grandmother's grandmother was born in that farmhouse in 1854. My husband died in the back bedroom in 2018. I will fight for it, and I will lose if I lose, and I will do so without your assistance. Good morning." She rose. Jax rose. They were on the sidewalk before Whitaker had finished reaching for the door. In the parking lot beside the courthouse, Jack sat for a full minute behind the wheel of his truck without starting the engine, and Eleanor sat beside him with her purse on her lap and her hands folded across it, and Smokey lay between them with her chin across Eleanor's left knee for the second time in 2 days. The November light through the windshield was thin and grey, and laid itself across the dashboard without warmth. "There's a VA legal aid line," Jack said. At last. "For dependents of veterans." Frank was service-connected for his hearing loss when he passed. He was, "Then you're a surviving spouse. There might be foreclosure protection. I don't know what it looks like for a second mortgage, but there might be something. I'll call them." Jack's. "I'll call them." She looked at him. Her grey eyes held his, and there was something in them now that had not been there yesterday. And he did not let himself name it. "You don't owe me this," she said. "I know. I won't be able to pay you back. I know that too." "Then why?" He sat with both hands on the wheel and looked out at the bare-branched maple at the edge of the parking lot. And he thought about the medal on her dashboard, and the shepherd Frank had loved, and the way her hand had turned when Smokey had laid her head on it. And he thought about a kitchen in Southern Virginia that did not exist anymore, and about a wife who had used every legal protection a married man takes for granted. He thought about a country that had spent 12 years asking him to stand between people he did not know and bullets that did not care, and a country that had then asked him to disappear quietly when the standing was done, because somebody should, he said. She did not answer. She put her gloved hand on Smokey's head and did not move it for a long time. The VA legal aid line was on hold for 93 minutes. Jack sat in the cab of his truck in the courthouse parking lot the entire time, with the engine running for the heater and his phone on speaker on the dashboard. Eleanor went into the diner across the square and brought back 2 coffees in styrofoam cups and a small paper bag with 2 warm biscuits in it. She handed him his without speaking. She sat in the passenger seat, and they drank the coffee and ate the biscuits and listened to the hold music, which was a single piano arrangement of a patriotic song Jack's could not place and did not want to. Smokey lay across both their laps and did not move. When the line finally picked up, the woman on the other end was named Mrs. Yvonne Castor, and she sounded tired in the particular way that women who worked at the VA in late October sounded tired, and she listened to Jack's explain Eleanor's situation, and she did not interrupt. When he was done, she said, "Mr. Harlan, I can help her, there's a process. It's slow. But Mrs. Beaumont has standing as a surviving spouse, and Mr. Beaumont's service record will give us leverage. I need you to fax me 5 forms by tomorrow at noon, and I need certified copies of the marriage certificate, the death certificate, and the original deed. Can you get those by tomorrow?" "We can," Jack said. "Then we can file. The filing will trigger a 30-day stay. The auction will be postponed. We won't beat them. We'll outlast them. Do you understand?" "I understand." He thanked her. He hung up. He put the phone in his jacket pocket. He did not look at Eleanor for a moment. "Did she?" Eleanor said. 30-day stay. We file by tomorrow noon." Eleanor Beaumont was quiet for a long time. Outside the truck, a man in a wool jacket walked past the hood with his hands in his pockets and did not look at them. Inside the truck, Smokey's slow breathing was the loudest sound. "My husband used to say," Eleanor said, "finally, that the army taught him there were only 2 kinds of men in a hard situation. The ones who saw the work, and the ones who saw the way out. And that you could not be both. You had to choose." He was right. He said the army had ruined him for ever doing anything halfway again. That sounds about right. She turned her head and looked at him fully for the first time since they had left Whitaker's office. The thin grey light was on her face, and the small creases at the corners of her eyes were soft in it, and she was a woman of 71 who had been beautiful once, and was something better than beautiful now, and her grey eyes were on his face without flinching. "You haven't asked me about my husband," she said. "No. Most people ask. They ask how he died, what he was like, whether I'm doing all right. They want to feel something and they want me to give it to them." "I know that kind. You're not that kind." "No." "Why?" He thought about it. He thought about the cicadas and the fluorescent hum in the courthouse basement and the kitchen in Southern Virginia. And he thought about how the people who asked the most always wanted the least of an answer. And he thought about Frank Beaumont driving up Calhoun Ridge Road in his work truck after Korea, with a German shepherd in the seat beside him, and not knowing what to say to his own wife. And he thought about how silence between two people who had carried things was its own kind of speaking. "Because if you want to tell me," he said, "you'll tell me." She turned and looked through the windshield at the grey courthouse square, and after a long quiet moment she began, in the same clear, unhurried voice, to tell him about Frank Beaumont, and the last bad year, and the nightmares that had come back hard at the end, and the morning he had not woken up. She did not cry. She did not pause. She told it the way a woman tells a story she has carried so long. The carrying has become the story. Jax did not interrupt. Smokey did not move. The November light did not change. When she was done, she sat for a moment, and then she said, "Drive me home, Jax Harlan. We have forms to find by tomorrow noon." He started the engine. They drove out of the courthouse parking lot, and as they passed the diner, 3 men at the front window booth looked up and watched them go, and one of them said something to the others, and the others laughed, and Eleanor saw it through the passenger window, and her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and she did not say anything, and Jax did not say anything, and they drove on. The storm started building over the ridge on the 11th day, a slow grey tower of cloud that rose up out of the southwest with the patient deliberation of weather that intended to take its time. It was Tuesday. The 30-day stay had been filed on Friday. Mrs. Castor at the VA had called Monday afternoon to say it had been accepted. Eleanor's foreclosure was postponed until December 18th. Jax had spent every day of the previous 10 driving down to the courthouse, sitting in the basement, faxing forms, sitting in the truck with Eleanor, while she made the calls she could not make alone, eating biscuits that she paid for with money she did not have, and not working on his own land. The cabin sat unfinished. The mine sat uncleared. The wood pile by the fire pit had not grown since the first frost. The phone call came at 4:30 that afternoon. Eleanor was in her kitchen on Calhoun Ridge Road, and Jax was sitting at her small oak table with Smokey at his feet, and a mug of coffee between his hands, and the receiver of the wall phone rang, and Eleanor crossed the kitchen and lifted it, and Jax knew from the way her shoulders set before she said hello that she already knew who it was. She listened for a long time. She said her son's name once. She said the word please once. She did not say anything else for almost 6 minutes. When she hung up, she stood for a moment with her hand on the receiver and her back to him, and her shoulders did not move, and her voice when she finally spoke was the same clear, unhurried voice it had always been, and underneath the voice was something Jax had not heard in it before. "My son does not want to help," she said. "He says the house is a money pit and that I should let it go. He says he can't afford to be involved. He says he loves me." Eleanor. He says he loves me. Jax. She did not turn around. She stood at the wall phone for another long moment, and then she walked to the sink and ran cold water over a dishcloth and wrung it out and laid it across the back of her neck, the way a woman does when she does not want to cry in front of someone. And she stood there with her hands on the rim of the sink, and her head bowed, and her grey hair coming loose from the knot at the base of her skull, and Smokey rose without sound from the kitchen floor, and crossed to her, and laid her head against the back of Eleanor's left knee, and Eleanor put one hand down behind her without looking and laid it on Smokey's broad, warm skull, and she stood that way for a long time. Jax did not move. He had learned a long time ago that some moments required not moving. He drove home through the early dusk with the grey tower of Storm Building behind him in the rearview mirror, and the bare hardwoods along Calhoun Ridge Road were black against the failing light, and the smell of weather was on the air the way it gets on the air in Tennessee when a system is coming down off the Cumberlands, the smell of cold metal and wet leaves, and something coming. Smokey lay across his right thigh with her chin on his knee. Her amber eyes were open. She had been watching him since they left Eleanor's kitchen. He stopped at the diner for coffee. He had not stopped at the diner since the first week. He stopped now because he had been awake since 4:30 that morning, and he had 2 more hours of driving to do before he reached the cabin, and he needed something hot in his hands. He left Smokey in the cab with the window cracked. He went in through the front door with the small brass bell over it, and the warm air inside the diner smelled of fryer grease and old coffee, and the pine cleaner the night cook used on the Formica counters. And the booths along the front window were full, and the booths along the back were empty, and the table in the middle of the room held 4 young men with bottles in front of them. The young men were maybe 22. They were the sons of farmers who had been the sons of farmers, and they wore ball caps pulled low, and their bottles were the long-neck kind, and there were 6 empty bottles between the 4 of them already, and the bottles had been there for a while. They looked up when Jax came in. They looked at his beard and his surplus jacket, and the canvas backpack he carried into every public space without thinking about it. One of them said something. The others laughed. The waitress behind the counter, a woman named Rita, who Jax knew slightly because she came to Roy Pritchard's hardware store on Saturdays for paint thinner, did not look at the table of young men. She looked at Jax. She mouthed the word coffee. Jax nodded. He sat at the counter on the stool farthest from the table. Rita poured the coffee. She set the cup in front of him. She did not charge him. "On me," she said quietly. "It's been a day. You don't have to. I know. Drink it." He drank it. The coffee was bad, but it was hot, and the cup was heavy in his hands, and the heat of it through the ceramic was something to hold on to. He felt the fluorescent hum from the long tubes above the counter pressing down on the back of his neck the way it always did, and he breathed once through his nose, slow, and pressed his thumbnail into the pad of his index finger until he felt the half moon, and he was still at the counter. And the diner was warm, and the young men at the table were laughing about something that had nothing to do with him. He had taken 3 swallows when one of the young men stood up from the table. The young man crossed the diner toward the front door. He had a half-empty long neck in his right hand. He did not look at Jax as he passed. He pushed through the front door, and the brass bell rang, and the cold air came in around the door frame, and the young man stood in the doorway for a moment, looking out at the grey dusk, and then he wound up and threw the half-empty bottle in a long underhand arc out into the parking lot. The bottle did not break. It came down on the asphalt of the parking lot, and it bounced once, and it rolled in a long, uneven curve across the lot, and it came to rest against the front passenger tyre of a parked Chevrolet, and the sound it made on the asphalt was a high, hollow, ringing metallic clatter that lasted perhaps a second and a half. It was the sound a mortar tube made when an empty casing was ejected onto stone. The diner went away. Jax was standing in a courtyard in eastern Afghanistan in the summer of the second deployment. The light was the wrong colour. The light was the white-yellow of the high sun, and the heat was on his shoulders, and the smell in the air was diesel exhaust and goat, and the dust that came up off the unpaved street when a vehicle went past, and the sound of the empty mortar casing was rolling on the stones near the wall to his left. Sergeant Daniel Ortiz was 8 feet ahead of him with his rifle on a high-ready specialist. Markel was on Jax's right. Smokey was not yet wounded. She was at his left heel with her head turned toward the wall. Her ears were forward. The cicadas were singing in the cypress at the edge of the courtyard in a long, dry, layered grinding sound. The mortar casing was rolling, it was rolling, it was rolling. He could not move. His hands were on the counter of the diner. He knew this. He could feel the formica under his palms, the slight cold of it, the small chip near his right thumb. He could feel the heavy ceramic of the coffee cup. He could see the cup. He could see Rita. Rita was looking at him with her mouth slightly open. He could see her. He could see all of this. He could not move. The pressure inside his chest was the pressure of a hand closing around his ribs from the inside. The breath he was trying to take was not coming. The fluorescent hum had become the only sound in the world. Somewhere very far away, a young man at a table was laughing. Smokey was in the truck. The truck was 20 feet beyond the front door. He had to get to her. He had to get to the truck. He had to. A weight pressed against his left thigh. The weight was 45 pounds, and it was warm, and it was steady, and it was the weight of a German shepherd who had not been in the diner 6 seconds ago, and was here now, and was pressing the length of her body against the outside of his left leg from his knee to his hip, with the careful, deliberate firmness of an animal who had done this exact thing at least 20 times in the last 7 years and knew the precise pressure required. He looked down. Smokey's amber eyes were on his. The window of the truck. He had cracked it. She had pushed it. She had gotten out. She had crossed the parking lot. She had pushed open the diner door with her shoulder. The bell. He had not heard the bell. "With me," he said. His voice did not sound like his voice. It sounded like a voice from a very long way off. He stood. He laid a $5 bill on the counter beside the coffee cup. He did not look at the table of young men. He walked to the front door with Smokey pressed against his left thigh the entire way, and he pushed through the door, and the cold air hit him, and the sky was the color of slate, and the wind was up, and he was outside in the parking lot of a diner in Briar Hollow, Tennessee, and he was 43 years old, and he was not in Afghanistan, and the mortar casing on the asphalt was a beer bottle that had not broken, and a young man inside the diner was laughing. He made it to the truck. He got the door open. He got Smokey up onto the bench seat. He climbed in behind the wheel. He shut the door. His hands started shaking. He sat with both hands on the wheel and watched them shake. They shook the way a thing shakes when it has held still too long. They shook for a long time. Smokey climbed across the bench seat and put her front paws on his right thigh and pressed the broad, warm flat of her chest against his arm and laid her head along the line of his collarbone, and her thick double coat was against the side of his neck, and he could feel her heart beating, slow and steady against his shoulder. He sat that way for a long time. He did not start the truck. He did not look at the diner. He did not look at the grey sky. He thought about driving west. He thought about it the way a man thinks about a thing that has occurred to him several times before in several different parking lots, in several different small towns. And he thought about how easy it would be. He had a quarter tank of gas. He had $390 in his wallet from the last of the savings. He had Smokey. He had the canvas backpack. He could be out of Tennessee by midnight. He could be in Arkansas by morning. He could be in Texas by the weekend. He could leave the cabin and the mine and the courthouse and the foreclosure and the woman on Calhoun Ridge Road and the son who had said please. He could leave all of it. The land would revert. The cabin would rot. Eleanor would lose the farmhouse. None of it would be his fault. He had not asked for any of it. He was a man who had given everything he had and been given nothing back, and no one in this country had any right to expect anything more from him. And Marisol was in Charlotte with Derek, and the boys did not know his face anymore, and Mrs. Yvonne Castor at the VA would file her own forms without him, and Eleanor Beaumont was a stranger he had met 12 days ago, and he could leave. His hand moved toward the ignition. Smokey did not let it. She shifted her weight on his lap, and her front left paw came down precisely on the back of his right hand, and she did not look at him, and she did not move, and she pinned his hand to his thigh with the steady, gentle, deliberate pressure of 45 pounds of dog who had decided he was not going to start the truck. He sat very still. He looked at her. She did not look at him. Her amber eyes were fixed on the windshield. The shaking in his hands stopped. He did not know how long he sat that way. The light in the parking lot went from grey to grey-blue to a thin watery dusk. The diner sign came on. A car pulled into the lot and parked, and a man got out and went inside, and Jax did not see him. When he finally moved, he did not move toward the ignition. He moved his left hand and laid it on the back of Smokey's neck, on the thick warm ruff under her ears, and he closed his eyes, and he did not cry, but his shoulders came down, and his breath came out of his chest in a long, slow shape that had been locked there for an hour, and he sat with his hand on her neck until the dusk was full and the parking lot lights came on. Then he started the truck. He drove home up the county road with both hands on the wheel, and Smokey pressed against his right side, and the storm tower over the ridge was black against the last of the western light. And when he reached the rutted drive, he turned in and climbed it slowly and parked beside the cabin. And he sat in the truck for another long moment, and then he got out. The cabin was dark, the fire pit was cold. He did not light a fire. He went into the cabin and he sat on the wooden chair beside the cold wood stove, and he sat in the dark for a long time, and Smokey lay across his boots. and outside the wind began to move in the bare hickories at the edge of the cleared yard. If he left her, he understood. He was leaving himself. The understanding came slowly. It came the way the dusk had come in the parking lot. It came without drama and without comfort. It came as a thing he had known for a while and had been unwilling to look at, and now he looked at it. He had not been running from this country for 12 days. He had been running from it for 3 years. He sat in the dark of the cabin until his hands were warm again, and then he stood, and he walked outside, and he laid a fire in the fire pit with hickory shavings and 3 split logs, and he lit it, and he sat beside it with Smoky against his right hip, and he watched the flames take. He would clear the mine in the morning. He would do it because Eleanor needed the foreclosure money he did not yet have, and because the mine was the only thing on the land that might produce something he could sell, and because he was going to stop running from this country tonight. He sat beside the fire for a long time. Smoky slept against his hip. The storm tower over the ridge moved closer. The wind came up. Somewhere far down the county road a single engine ran and faded and was gone. He went into the truck cab a little before midnight, and he slept, for the first time in 3 weeks, more than 2 hours without waking. The morning came in cold and steady, with a thin grey light that had no shadows in it, and the kind of windless quiet that comes before a system breaks. Jax woke in the truck cab at 5:40. Smoky was already up, already at the fire pit, already watching the tree line at the top of the ridge. He sat up. He laced his boots. He pulled his canvas backpack out from under the bench seat and laid it on the gravel beside the truck, and did the small precise inventory he had been doing every morning since 2009. Knife, headlamp, spare batteries, first aid, water bottle, bandana, matches. The list was old, the list was good. He drank a cup of coffee at the fire pit standing up. He fed Smoky a portion of kibble and a strip of jerky. He put the second headlamp and the long battery-powered camp lantern, and the heavier of the 2 pry bars, and the folding shovel into a 5-gallon plastic bucket, and he carried the bucket up the slope toward the mouth of the Pritchard mine in the base of the ridge, and Smoky paced beside him at his left heel, with her ears forward, and her amber eyes already on the dark mouth ahead. The mine entrance was a low arch of native stone with the rusted iron rails of the original ore cart line still embedded in the dirt floor, and 4 heavy timber braces still standing along the first 30 feet of the shaft. The braces were oak. They were nearly 120 years old. The state inspector in 1947 had condemned them not because they had failed, but because the company that had owned them had stopped paying for them. The braces had stood for 79 more years without complaint. Jax had walked the first chamber 4 times in the last 6 weeks and tested each brace with a sledge and a hand line and a level, and they were sound. The rock above them was sound. The mine would hold. He stepped inside. The cold inside the mine was different from the cold outside. The cold inside the mine was constant. It was 54 degrees year-round, a fact he had read in an old USGS pamphlet about Tennessee bituminous coal seams, and the air inside it carried the slow mineral smell of damp rock and old iron, and the faint sweet rot of timber that had not been new in 100 years. He turned on the camp lantern and set it on a flat ledge of rock just inside the entrance, and the soft white light pushed back the dark for 15 feet, and Smoky walked ahead of him into the chamber, with her plumed tail carried low, and her shoulders relaxed, and she did what she always did when she entered a new dark space, which was to walk the perimeter once with her nose, 6 inches off the floor, and her ears in slow scanning motion, and Jax let her work. He had been clearing the first chamber for 3 weeks. The chamber was roughly 20 feet wide and 40 feet deep, with a low ceiling that rose to 9 feet at the centre, and the back wall of it was a roughly worked face of native stone where the original miners had stopped digging in 1944 and gone home for a war they did not yet know was coming. The floor had been packed with 20 inches of fallen slate and rotted timber, and old canvas and the occasional rusted tin, and Jax had cleared most of it out by hand with the folding shovel and the wheelbarrow he had bought used from Roy Pritchard for $30. What remained was the back 12 feet, which he had been working at for the last 4 days, and where the original miners had set their last bracing against the back wall, 2 heavy oak timbers driven vertically into the floor against a crossbeam at the ceiling, holding back the loose stone behind them. The 2 vertical timbers had rotted at the base. He had seen it 2 days ago. He had been planning to replace them today with the 2 new oak posts he had bought from the lumber yard in Knoxville and brought up in the bed of the truck on Sunday morning. Smokey was acting strangely. He had noticed it within 5 minutes of entering the chamber. She had finished her perimeter walk, and she had not lain down at the entrance the way she usually did, and she had not come to his left heel the way she usually did. She had walked twice, past him to the back of the chamber, and stood for a long moment in front of the rotted timbers and lifted her nose and held it there and then turned and come back to him and stood at his left heel for perhaps 30 seconds and then walked back to the timbers again. He did not interrupt her work. He had learned a long time ago that when Smokey was working, you let her work. You did not call her. You did not make her sit. You did not redirect. You let her find what she was finding, because what she was finding was always real, and the only mistake a handler could make was to not trust the dog. The 3rd time she came back from the timbers, she stopped at his left heel and lifted her nose and pressed it once against his bare hand, the small, precise gesture she had not made in 7 years, the alert signal she had been trained to give in the field when she had located something her handler had not yet seen. She held the contact for a count of 2. Then she turned and walked back to the timbers and stood there and waited. Jax went very still. He had not seen her do that signal since a courtyard wall in eastern Afghanistan in the summer of the 2nd deployment. The day before she had been wounded, the day she had pressed her nose against his hand and led him 3 steps to the left and shown him a wire. He had not realized until this moment that he had remembered the exact pressure of that contact for 7 years. He set the wheelbarrow down. He walked slowly to the back of the chamber. The 2 rotted timbers stood against the rough back wall. Behind them was loose stone. He knew that. He had assumed that. But Smokey was not standing in front of the timbers. Smokey was standing 2 feet to the right of them, in front of a section of the back wall that was not rough native stone, but was instead a careful course of stacked smaller stones, mortared with what looked like a lime and clay mix, set so cleanly into the face of the wall that he had not noticed it across 3 weeks of working in this chamber by lantern light. He had not noticed it because the rotted timbers had been in front of it. He knelt. The mortared stones formed a roughly oval shape, perhaps 30 inches wide and 40 inches tall, set flush with the face of the back wall. He pressed the flat of his palm against them. They were colder than the surrounding stone. They were colder because there was empty space behind them. Cold air was moving against the back of his hand through the pinprick gaps in the old mortar. Smokey poured once, deliberately, at the bottom edge of the oval. She had never poured at a wall in her life. He had trained that out of her in 2010 because he did not want her disturbing structures in the field. She had not poured at anything in 14 years. She poured once now with her right front paw, and then she sat down on her haunches and she looked at him with her amber eyes steady and ancient, and she did not move. He went and got the pry bar. The mortar was old enough that it crumbled to a fine grey-brown dust under the tip of the bar. He worked carefully, the way a man works on something that might be a grave, removing the stones one at a time, stacking them on the floor of the chamber to his left, and after the first 3 stones came out, a soft, slow exhale of air came out of the opening, a smell of old oilskin and old iron and dry, undisturbed darkness. He worked for 40 minutes. When the opening was wide enough for a man to fit through on his stomach, he stopped. He sat back on his heels. He wiped his face with the back of his glove. He looked at Smokey. Smokey was already moving. She had risen from her sit, and she was walking in the unhurried military way she had walked through 1,000 doorways in 3 countries, directly into the opening, and she lowered her shoulders and she went in flat, and she was gone. He waited 11 seconds. He heard the soft scratch of her nails on stone. He heard her breathing. He heard her stop. He went in after her on his stomach with the headlamp on his head. The crawl space was perhaps 8 feet long. It opened into a small chamber. roughly 6 feet wide and 7 feet deep and 5 feet high, hewn into the back wall of the original mine by hands that had not been miners. The walls were rougher than the main chamber. The floor was packed dirt. The air inside was bone dry. The headlamp beam moved across the small space, and Smokey was sitting against the far wall, and in front of her, along the base of the far wall, were 3 objects. The first was a saddlebag, heavy oilskin, cracked with age, the leather straps mostly rotted, set against the rock with a deliberate care that suggested someone had laid it down rather than dropped it. The second was a long oilskin bundle, wrapped tight and tied with leather thongs. The third was a small leather pouch, the size of a man's 2 cupped hands, set on top of the bundle. Jax knelt in front of the 3 objects. He did not touch them yet. He looked at Smokey. Smokey's amber eyes held his, and she did not move, and her breathing was slow and steady, and the small chamber was quiet. He lifted the leather pouch first. The drawstring was rotted. It came apart in his fingers. Inside the pouch, wrapped in a square of folded oilskin, were 2 things. The first was a tintype photograph. The second was a folded letter, the paper yellowed to the colour of old tea, the folds deep and stiff. He took both out, carefully, and he sat back on his heels and he turned the headlamp beam on them. The tintype was of 3 people. A young man, perhaps 25, in the grey short jacket of a Confederate enlisted soldier, with a thin face and a long jaw and dark eyes that looked directly into the lens without smiling. A young woman beside him, perhaps 22, in a high-collared dress, with her hair drawn back severely from her face, her hand resting on the man's shoulder. In her arms, an infant in a long christening gown, perhaps 4 months old, blurred by the long exposure. The 3 of them stood in front of a backdrop of painted columns in some itinerant photographer's tent, and the photograph was small, and it was clear, and it was a man and a woman and a child looking at the camera without any idea what was coming. He set the tintype on his knee. He unfolded the letter. The handwriting was small and careful and slanted to the right, the writing of a man who had been taught penmanship by a mother who had cared about it. The ink was iron gall and had faded to a soft brown. He read it slowly by the headlamp beam. He read it a second time. He read it a third time. He sat in the small chamber for a long time after he read it the third time, with the headlamp beam on the page, and his breath coming out slow, and even into the dry, cold air, and Smokey beside him with her chin laid across his right boot. And the silence around them was the silence of a place that had not held a human voice in 162 years. The letter was dated November 9th, 1864. It was addressed to my dearest Henrietta. It was signed your devoted husband, Samuel Calhoun. It said in the small, careful, slanted hand that he had walked away from his unit at Resaca and had been hiding in the hills of East Tennessee for 6 weeks. It said he was carrying with him a saddlebag of gold and Confederate currency, and 1 federal note pouch that had been intended as quartermaster pay for 2 regiments, and that he had taken for reasons God would have to forgive him for or not. It said the war would be over by spring, and that everyone with sense knew it, and that he had decided he would not spend another month killing men whose faces he could not see for a cause he had stopped believing in. It said he was hiding the money in the old Pritchard mine on his own family's land, which was the last place anyone would think to look for a Confederate paymaster's purse, and that when the war ended and the roads were safe, he would come back for it, and he would come home, and he would build her a proper house with the money, and he would hold the boy in his arms again, and he would never leave Henrietta, or the child, or this ground for as long as he lived. It said he loved her more than his life. It said he was sorry for the months of silence. It said he would be home by April. It was signed in the small, careful slant, Samuel. Samuel Calhoun did not come home in April. Samuel Calhoun had not come home at all. Samuel Calhoun had been, somewhere in the woods of East Tennessee in the winter of 1864, killed by men whose names no one had ever recorded, and his wife Henrietta had raised their son alone in a one-room cabin 3 counties over, and she had told the boy his father had walked off into the war and never come back, and the boy had told his daughter, and the daughter had told her son, and the son had told his daughter, and the daughter had told her son, and the son had told Eleanor. Jax sat with the letter on his knee. He looked at the tintype. He looked at the young man with the long jaw and the dark eyes that looked directly into the lens. He looked at the young woman with her hair drawn back severely from her face, and her hand on her husband's shoulder. He looked at the 4-month-old child in her arms. He thought about a wife in Charlotte and a kitchen in Southern Virginia and 2 boys he did not know any more. And he thought about a man who had wanted nothing in the world except to come home to his wife and his son, and had been killed before he could, and his eyes burned and he did not let them spill. Smokey lifted her head. She laid her chin against his thigh. He reached down and put his hand on her broad, warm skull. "Good girl," he said. His voice came out rough. He did not say anything else. He stayed in the small chamber for another 20 minutes. He did not open the saddlebag. He did not unwrap the long oilskin bundle. He understood in the slow, patient way understanding comes to a man kneeling in a hidden place, that what he had found was not gold. What he had found was a husband trying to come home from a war. What he had found was Eleanor's family. He folded the letter back along its old creases and slid it into the oilskin square and slid the tintype in beside it and slid the whole into his inside jacket pocket against his chest. He set the pouch back where he had found it. He did not move the saddlebag or the bundle. He backed out of the crawl space on his stomach, and Smokey came with him, and he sat for a moment in the main chamber by the camp lantern. And then he stood, and he walked to the mouth of the mine, and he stepped out into the grey cold morning. He drove up Calhoun Ridge Road without calling first. Eleanor was on the porch in her brown wool coat with a cup of tea in her hands, watching the storm tower over the ridge, and she saw him pull in, and she did not move from the porch chair, and she watched him climb the steps with Smokey at his left heel and the small oilskin square in his right hand, and her grey eyes went to the oilskin and then to his face, and she set the tea down on the porch rail without a word. "I need you to read something," he said. She took the oilskin. She unfolded it with hands that did not yet know what they were unfolding. The tintype came out into her lap. She picked it up. She looked at it. Her face did not change for a long moment. Then it did. Then she looked up at him with the grey eyes wide and the breath caught in her chest, and she did not say anything, and he handed her the letter, and she sat down very carefully in the porch chair, and she read it. She read it 3 times. She read it the way she had read everything for the last 8 years, slowly, without interruption, with her lips moving slightly on the harder words. When she finished the 3rd reading, she did not speak for a long time. The wind came up in the bare hickories at the edge of her yard. The storm tower over the ridge moved closer. "Samuel," she said. It was the only word she said for almost 2 minutes. She said it once, and she laid the letter on her knee, and she put her hand flat against the small, careful, slanted writing. And she sat with her hand on the page, and her grey eyes on the grey sky, and her shoulders very straight in the brown wool coat. And Smokey lay down beside the porch chair, and laid her head across Eleanor's left foot. The first tears did not come until the wind moved in the hickories a second time. They came without sound. They came down her face one at a time, and they did not stop. She did not raise her hand to wipe them. She held the letter against her knee, and she let them come. Jax stood at the porch rail with his back to her, looking at the grey sky over the ridge, because he understood that what was happening behind him was not for him to witness directly. He understood that some moments belonged to the person inside them. After a while, she said, he was 25. Yes. He had a son. Yes. He was 4 months old. Yes. My great-grandfather. Yes. She did not speak again for a long time. The wind moved. The hickories creaked. Somewhere far down the ridge a single car passed on the county road and was gone. He was trying to come home, she said. Finally. He was a deserter. He was a husband. She turned her head and looked at him then, and her grey eyes held his with the tears still tracked on her cheeks, and she did not blink. And after a long moment she said, "Where was he?" "In a hidden chamber in the back wall of the Pritchard mine. Smokey found him, behind the rotted timbers." How long? 162 years. She closed her eyes. Her hand on the letter did not move. Smokey's chin on her foot did not move. The first slow drops of rain began to fall on the porch roof above them, and they made a soft, uneven sound on the old tin, and the sound deepened, and within a minute it was a steady cold November rain coming down off the ridge, and the storm had started. They sat on the porch for almost an hour, while the rain came down on the tin roof, and the wind moved in the hickories, and the grey light over the ridge faded to a deeper grey. Eleanor did not move from the chair. The letter and the tintype lay on her knee under the flat of her hand. Smokey lay against her left foot. Jack stood at the rail with his back to her until she said his name, quietly, and then he turned and pulled the second porch chair up beside hers and sat. "There's more," he said. "In the chamber." "How much more?" "A saddlebag. A long bundle. I didn't open them." "Why?" "Because the letter was the first thing. Everything else can wait." She nodded slowly. She looked at him for a long moment with the rain coming down behind him, and then she said, "There's something I need to tell you, Jax, before this goes any further." "Yes." "The 14 acres you bought. The co-parcel." "Yes." "It was Calhoun land." He sat very still. "The original homestead," she said. "From the 1820s. 640 acres. Granted to my great-great-great-grandfather by the state of Tennessee for service in the War of 1812. The Pritchard mine was on it. The bottom land was on it. The ridge I'm sitting on right now was on it. All of it." "How did it leave the family?" "After the war, Henrietta couldn't pay the property tax. She had no husband and no income, and a small son and 400 acres of timber that nobody would buy. The county auctioned it off in 1881. In pieces, the mine parcel was the last to go. It was sold to a man named Pritchard for $19. He never worked it well enough to make it pay. He sold it to the next man. The next man sold it to the next one. By the time it got to Old Co. in 1972, it had passed through 9 owners and nobody remembered it had ever been Calhoun land. You knew. My grandmother told me. She got it from her grandmother. The story stayed in the family because there was nothing else to keep. So when I bought it, you bought my great-great-great-grandfather's land back from the county for $9,400. He sat with both hands on his knees and looked out at the rain. "I didn't know," he said. "No, you couldn't have. I bought it fair. You bought it fair. The deed is yours. Nothing in this conversation changes that. Eleanor, I am telling you because it is the truth. And because the gold in that mine was hidden by my husband's wife's grandfather's grandfather, and because the man who hid it died trying to come home to a woman who is still buried on the ridge above this house, and because if you and I are going to stand together in what comes next, you have to know what you're standing on." He did not answer her for a long time. The rain came down harder on the porch roof. The wind moved in the hickories. A small branch came loose somewhere up the ridge, and fell with a crack that was not the crack of any other sound, and was gone. "What I'm standing on," he said, "finally, is your family's ground." "Yes." "And the gold in the mine." "Yes." "Belongs to you." "It belongs to the man who found it." "Eleanor." "You found it." "Jax." "The deed is yours. The mine is on your land. The law is clear. Don't argue with me about the law. I have been arguing with the law for 4 months, and I do not want to argue with it on my own porch." She said it without heat. She said it the way she said everything, with the small precise clarity of a woman who had decided what was true and was not going to be moved off it by sentiment. He sat for a long moment, and then he said, "We'll talk about the gold tomorrow." "All right. I need to do something else first." "All right." He stood. He looked at the rain. He looked at the grey ridge across the road. He looked back at her. "Your access road floods, doesn't it?" he said. "When the tributary jumps its banks. Twice in my life. Once in 74. Once in 2003. And the lower hollow. The lower hollow goes under any time the river comes up more than 4 feet. How many people down there? 17 households along the river road. Maybe 45 souls. They have warnings. They have a county text alert. Half of them don't have phones that work down there. Cell signal's bad in the bottom. He looked at the grey sky a long moment. Eleanor, he said, I think the river's going to come up tonight. She looked at him. What do you want to do? She said. I want to drive down to the lower hollow before the road floods. Knock on every door. Tell them to come up. Tell them they can come to my cabin. Your cabin's a tin shack with no insulation. My mine's 54 degrees year-round and dry as bone. We can run a stove in the front chamber. We have walls. We have height. The water won't reach us. How many can you fit? All of them. For how long? As long as it takes. She did not hesitate. She rose from the porch chair. The letter and the tintype already folded back into the oilskin square in her lap. And she said, I'll bring the food and the blankets. You go knock on doors. Eleanor, go. Jax. He went. He drove down off Calhoun Ridge Road with the wipers on full and the rain coming down in sheets against the windshield, and Smokey pressed against his right side, and he made the bridge over the tributary at 4:15 in the afternoon. The water was already 6 inches over the bridge deck. He drove through it. The truck took the water like the truck it was. He turned onto River Road and he started knocking on doors. The first door was a single wide trailer set up on cinder blocks. The man who opened it was named Curtis Hale. He was 68. His wife was in a wheelchair from a stroke in 2019. They had a son in Nashville who could not come tonight. Jax loaded both of them into the cab of his truck in 15 minutes, drove them up to the cabin, came back down. The bridge was 8 inches under by then. The second door was the Tilghman family, 3 children under 10. The mother was a nurse on shift in Knoxville. The father was a long-haul trucker in Kentucky. The grandmother was watching the children. Jax loaded all 4 into the cab on the second trip. The third door was the trailer of one of the young men who had been at the diner table. He was 22, and his name was Cody Buckner, and he stood in the doorway in his underwear, with a hangover and a hunting rifle, and he did not at first recognize the bearded man on his porch, and when he did, his face did several things, and Jax did not give him time to settle on one of them. Your trailer's going to be under 5 feet of water by midnight, Jax said. I have room for you up at the cabin. Get your boots. Cody Buckner stared at him. Now, Jax said. He got his boots. By 6:30 he had made 11 runs down the flooded road and back up the rutted drive to the cabin, and the bridge was under 30 inches and the water was over the floorboards of his truck on the last run, and the engine had stalled twice. And the front chamber of the Pritchard mine was full of 43 people sitting on blankets and folding chairs that Eleanor had hauled down from her farmhouse in the bed of her dead husband's old work pickup before her starter finally gave out. Eleanor was in the cabin. She had set a kettle on the wood stove. She had 3 propane camp stoves running on the porch under a tarp. She had 2 pots of beef stew and 1 of cornbread batter, and a pile of biscuits on a sheet pan. She had organized 17 households into a single quiet operation by the time Jax came up with the last truckload, and the cabin was warm, and the mine was warm, and the wood smoke was going up the chimney pipe. And somewhere in the back chamber a small child was crying, and a German shepherd had walked back and laid her broad, warm body the full length of the child's right side, and the child had stopped crying. Jax stood in the cabin door with the rain running off his coat and his hair plastered to his face. And Eleanor looked up from the stove and said, "Sit down. You need to eat." He sat. She put a bowl of stew in front of him. He ate it. She put a piece of cornbread on a plate. He ate it. She put a cup of coffee in his hand. He drank it. She did not speak during any of this. He did not speak. Smokey lay across his boots. By 8 o'clock the river had jumped the second bank, and the lower hollow was a black sheet of moving water from the foot of the ridge to the highway 2 miles south, and the cabin and the mine sat on their 50-foot rise in the dark like an island, and 43 souls slept and woke and slept again on blankets in a 120-year-old coal chamber that was 54 degrees year-round and dry as bone. And Cody Buckner sat against the back wall of the front chamber with a wool blanket over his shoulders, and did not look at Jax, and did not speak to him, and did not need to. The waters did not begin to recede until 2 days later. When they did, the lower hollow was a wreck. 8 trailers were gone outright, washed off their blocks and broken apart against the trees a quarter-mile downstream. The rest were standing but ruined, the floors warped, the walls black with mud, the contents destroyed. The bridge had survived, the road would take a county crew 3 weeks. The 43 people who had slept in the mine went home in pieces over 4 days, walking out in the morning with biscuits Eleanor had baked and a thermos of coffee, and an address to come back to if they needed anything, and not one of them, not Cody Buckner and not the men who had laughed in the booth that night, said the word sorry to Jax Harlan, and not one of them needed to. The thank yous came differently. Curtis Hale brought up a rebuilt alternator 3 weeks later for Eleanor's old Ford and would not take money for it. The Tilghman grandmother sent her grandson up with a casserole every Sunday for 2 months. Cody Buckner showed up one Saturday morning in late November with 2 of his cousins and 4 chainsaws, and they cleared the ridge of fallen hickory for a full day without speaking, and went home at dusk with a wave that was not a wave so much as a small lift of the hand. Roy Pritchard from the hardware store, whose shop had been on high ground and untouched, drove up one afternoon with a brand new propane heater in the bed of his truck, and set it on Jax's porch and said, "Don't argue," and drove away. A week after the flood, Jax and Eleanor sat at her kitchen table on Calhoun Ridge Road, with the saddlebag and the long oilskin bundle on the floor between them, and they opened them. The saddlebag held 311 gold coins, United States double eagles mostly, with 12 British sovereigns and 4 Mexican 8 escudo pieces mixed in. The long bundle held $42,000 in Confederate paper currency, which a numismatist in Knoxville would later explain to them was worth almost nothing as money but a great deal to certain collectors as artifact. The leather pouch had held the letter and the tintype. There was also a small rusted tin in the saddlebag that contained Samuel Calhoun's pocket watch, his wedding ring, and a lock of dark hair tied with a thin red ribbon, which Eleanor identified as Henrietta's hair because she had a matching lock in a tin under her bed. The numismatist in Knoxville, a man named Halloran who was 80 and honest, valued the coins at $197,000 on the conservative low estimate and $241,000 on the high. The Confederate paper, sold carefully through the right channels over a year, would bring perhaps another $60,000. The total conservatively was $250,000. Jax sat at Eleanor's kitchen table and slid the entire low-estimate stack of figures across to her side of the table. "Half is yours," he said. "Jax, half is yours. Eleanor." The land was Calhoun. The man was Calhoun. The hair in that tin is your great-great-grandmother's. We're not arguing this. You found it. My dog found it. And my dog has been telling me to help you for 2 months. I'm going to listen to my dog. She looked at him for a long moment across the table. The November light was on her face, and the small creases at the corners of her eyes were soft in it, and her grey eyes held his, and after a long moment she nodded once, slowly, the way a woman who had been arguing with the law for 4 months acknowledged a thing she was not going to argue with any more. "Half," she said. "Half." She paid off the second mortgage on Calhoun Ridge Road on the 9th of December, 4 days before the rescheduled foreclosure auction, with a cashier's check from the Knoxville bank. Mrs. Yvonne Castor at the VA called her 2 days later to congratulate her, and Eleanor thanked her, and after she hung up she sat in her kitchen for a long time, and looked at her grandmother's house, which was hers now in a way it had not been in 4 months, and she did not cry, and she did not need to. Jax used his half slowly. He paid for the lower back surgery he had been postponing for 2 years. He paid a Knoxville builder to put up a real cabin on his 14 acres, 28 feet by 32 feet, with a stone foundation and a real wood stove and a proper porch on the west side. He had a fenced run built for Smokey against the south wall, with a heated doghouse inside it, though Smokey never slept in it because she still slept across his boots. He set aside enough to cover Smokey's veterinary care for whatever years she had left. He did not buy a new truck. The old one had brought him here. And one Tuesday in early January, He drove down to Roy Pritchard's hardware store and went in and asked Roy quietly, in the back office where Roy did the books, whether his daughter's medical bills from the hospital in Nashville were still outstanding. Roy stared at him for a long moment. Roy's daughter had been hit by a drunk driver in October. Roy's daughter had survived. The bills had not. They are, Roy said. What's the figure? 41,000. Jax set a manila envelope on Roy's desk. Don't tell anyone where this came from, he said. Including me. Jax. That's the deal. Roy. Take it or don't. Roy Pritchard looked at the envelope. He looked at Jax. He nodded. Once. Slowly. And he did not say thank you, because Jax had told him not to. And Jax left the back office and walked through the store and out the front door. And Smokey was waiting for him in the cab of the truck. The spring came early that year. By the middle of April, the dogwoods on the ridge above the cabin had begun to bloom, white against the grey-green of the new hardwood leaves, and the small stream that ran along the south property line had settled back into its summer course. Eleanor's vegetable stand at the bottom of Calhoun Ridge Road was open again on Saturdays. Beside it she had set a hand-painted sign that read Beaumont Vegetables, and beneath it, in smaller letters, EST 1854. The sign was new. She had painted it herself in February. At the mouth of the Pritchard mine, just inside the timber bracing at the entrance, Jax had built a small stone shelf out of the same native rock the mine itself was hewn from. On the shelf stood a framed copy of the tintype, the small, careful slanted writing of the original letter, a Korean service medal on a faded ribbon, and a single hand-cut wooden cross with 3 names on it: Samuel Calhoun, Henrietta Calhoun, Frank Beaumont. The cross had been made from a section of one of the rotted oak timbers that had hidden the chamber for 120 years. That evening in late April, Jax sat on the new porch of the new cabin he had built with his own hands, watching the sun go down behind the ridge, with Smokey's broad warm head on his right knee, and the cicadas starting up in the hickories at the edge of the yard. Down the long rutted drive, the headlights of a faded red Ford pickup turned in off the county road and began the slow climb. On the seat beside the driver was a covered casserole dish. He stood. He laid a hand on Smokey's neck. He waited for her on the porch. A man does not become invisible because the world stopped looking. A man becomes invisible only when he stops fighting to be seen by the right people. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.